What institutional and societal constraints exist and should be cause for concern?
At the moment, I think we're seeing both individuals and institutions colonized by notions of human autonomy, which require not only affirmation but participation. So, for example, with euthanasia, if we decide that it belongs to a person's autonomy to determine the end of their own life, then we also ask hospitals, even religious hospitals, and doctors, even religious doctors who have some objection to euthanasia, to participate. And if they don't participate, that's problematic because they are effectively passing moral judgment on the people who are asking for euthanasia, and they are making it harder for these people to receive the assistance in killing themselves that they are seeking. So that's just one example, but there is a certain zero-sum game being played here. It's not a matter of, well, I want to do this and you don't, so I will and you won't. It's I will and you must help me.
If freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom, can it also be argued to be a foundational freedom?
Fundamental and foundational mean the same thing, but if you're asking whether I think freedom of religion is fundamental and it's the kind of freedom that if you don't have it, you won't have other freedoms, yes, I think that's true. And there's a reason for that. The freedom of religion is a freedom to articulate in one way or another your thanking and honoring God as the giver of good gifts to creatures. If you don't have the liberty to do that in a public way, then really you're not going to have other liberties, because those good gifts are going to be understood as given to you by somebody other than the Creator, given to you by your social group, given to you by the state. And whoever gives them is master of them, you see, so can withdraw them. They don't belong fundamentally to you. Whereas if it's God who's giving them, and He's giving them to all creatures, then they do belong to you fundamentally, and even the state, in principle, cannot take them away. So I think this is a very fundamental freedom indeed, the freedom to acknowledge and give thanks to the God who gives all of these things, and does so, if you like, pre-politically. That is, the state is an observer and a supporter, not the actual source of these rights.
Freedom of religion, like other freedoms, is understood to be born and exercised first and foremost by individuals. But what about the role of faith communities or faith-based institutions? Do they exercise these freedoms as communities of faithful individuals?
Well, I don't concede the premise. That is to say, you're quite right that these things are often approached as individual rights and freedoms, and there's some good reason to do that. But religion, by its very nature, I mean, the very word comes from the Latin religare, which means to bind. To bind people, first of all, to their duty to give thanks to God, and to bind them to one another in the act of giving thanks to God. Religion is, by its nature, corporate and communal. It is not, by its nature, individual. So freedom of religion, you can't coherently approach it as strictly an individual right. There's an individual component to it, but religion itself forces you to deal with communities. And so it ought to be understood communally, first of all, and individually second.
How do we ensure, and why must we ensure, the robust exercise of religious freedom within a multi-faith and multicultural society?
I think we must deal with it in any society, and I actually, there's nothing new about multicultural societies. There have been multicultural societies wherever there's any large society. Any urban center in the ancient world, for example, was multicultural. You don't have to wait for our own time for that. So there's a tension here between the needs of the larger society, which to have a viable culture has to make some commitments on basics, and that would include religious basics. There's a tension between that need and the need of the smaller communities that are mixed with them or attached to them in their cities and now in their nations. How do you make provisions for those minority groups? Certainly we have to make provisions. There has to be accommodation. The prevailing culture should not be determinative of fully determinative of every subculture within it. You wouldn't have subcultures if it were. And subculture is an important dimension of freedom. Freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and freedom to exercise one's religious and moral and political beliefs. So there always has to be a balancing between the needs of the larger culture and the needs of the subcultures that are attached to it. And these are not things you can settle absolutely and simply apply in some automatic way. They're boundaries that have to be negotiated. But I think one of the most important things that I was trying to communicate to colleagues today is that often without our even understanding it, there's an implicit concession to an atheistic worldview, which then the negotiation is all about how do you accommodate this or that religious worldview. And I contend that all worldviews are in some sense religious. That just because your commitments to what a human being is and where the world came from and so forth are not articulated in theological or religious terms doesn't mean that you're not making claims that are just as basic and just as sometimes unexamined as someone from a religious community who is making their claims in religious terms. Moreover, those societies that have insisted on making atheism the default position have fared very badly historically in the 20th century. This is the first time you ever had them, really. And they fared very badly in terms of human rights and human freedoms, and eventually collapsed because of their moral incoherence as well as its effects on their economies and so forth. So I think it's time that people understood that the need here is not to accommodate religion. The need here is to be honest about what worldviews different people have and which elements we consider to be crucial to a common culture. So I'm trying to encourage people not to be afraid in the public sphere to be explicit about their worldviews, whether they regard themselves as religious or not, and to seek in that more honest exchange an understanding about what things we actually can say in common and commit ourselves to together, and where we can't do that, to understand where the limits are of imposing on one another our own position.